a continuous a propaganda by the Israeli state to rewrite history as to what happened to the Palestinian people. And I think personally that is unjustifiable. I'm not saying that the Jews haven't been victims. I'm not saying that the Jews are not victims today. They are. In many parts of the world, Jews are persecuted. They are hated. They are. And I think wrongly. And Islamically, I would, as a Muslim, stand up for the Jew. If a Muslim today, God forbid, was to attack you, I would stand up for you. Because this is what my religion tells me to do. Because it says, stand up against injustice. It doesn't matter who it's towards. Whether a Jew, whether a Christian, whether an atheist, it's irrelevant. And Allah says, in the Quran, Allah says, do not let your, I think it says, dislike of a people to make you unjust. So because maybe, you might say, okay, the state of Israel is doing this, I don't like what they're doing. That does not now mean that you can be unjust to all Jews, because that's against Islam. But what I'm finding repeatedly is that there is this campaign over the last 30, 40 years to malign the Palestinian position, which is now widely recognized by many Jews who themselves are proud Jews, practicing Jews, that what's happening to the Palestinian people is wrong. That's why I dislike Joseph's arguments about Palestine and Israel, because he's not honest about it. Right. He gives this sort of slant that Palestine did not exist. Then you go and look at some of the old archives and you see the word Palestine on buildings dating back to 30s and 40s.
He's not saying Palestine didn't exist. He's saying
as a state.
He's saying as a state it didn't exist.
The people didn't exist. It was a barren land. And the Jews sort of went there, they built the state of Israel, and there was like just scattered tribes or whatever. When you go back to the old archives of videos and photographs, and in fact, I think there was a Jewish historian, I forget his name now, he said far from it just being, an unoccupied land, there's a flourishing people here, the Palestinian people. Right. So this rewriting of history I find very uncomfortable, really.
So personally, I haven't read the sources. I don't know.
But Josh, I'd love for you to just watch that debate.
Right.
And the reason why I think it's a very fair debate is because Finkelstein is a professor, well known in his academic accolade, right? Recognized by many Jews as well, that has provided the finest work on history and has made his place in history. And these are some practicing Jews who've said this, right? They might not agree with all of his arguments, right? But they've agreed that, he's an honest, decent fellow, right? You got Dershowitz on the other side, who's a Harvard professor of law. So he's no layperson like me or you, right? He knows the arguments. He writes his book, A Case for Israel. And Finkelstein, to be honest, totally demolishes him. And not only does he demolish him, but he, I think, categorically proves beyond a reasonable doubt that there is actually manipulation and lies when it comes to the case for the Palestinians and their right to exist and the circumstances that arose as to the expulsion of these people. And I think I would assure you, watch that debate and then come back to me. We'll have a discussion about it.
Cool.
But
right, there are some interesting issues though that often get brought up.
Yes.
And actually, I was thinking about one or two of them earlier today. Maybe I can speak to you about them.
Yeah.
The whole issue about the blockade with Gaza.
Yes.
What do you think the solution is?
Look.
Do you think they should just tear down the wall suddenly?
The reality here is this, If you look at the blockade, look at the sources, look at the United Nations, look at Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, B'Tselem. What are they blocking?
The settlements?
They're blocking even things like midwife kits for the midwives to give birth to children.
What you mean by blocking?
Right? They're blocking things like chocolate. They're smuggling chocolate in from Egypt, and they're medicine. And they're saying, the scissors can be melted down to make bullets. This is nonsense, come on. This is utter nonsense. And the thing is this, Josh.
But what I'm saying is, do you think they should take down
the wall?
Yeah.
Well, under international law, it's illegal.
But do you think morally...
My Jewish friends
Yes.
often say that we have a legal right to Israel because it was given to us by the United Nations. A lot of Jews have said this to me.
Right. I don't buy that.
Well, you don't because you're Orthodox, right?
But even so, I still don't buy it because I don't see United Nations as
Anyway,
particularly legitimate.
exactly. But even if you were to argue
Right.
that, okay, the international community got together and they gave this land to the Jews, it belonged to somebody else, but some of my Jewish friends say to me, but it is justified because it was given to us by a unanimous, let's say, vote within the United Nations, right? I don't agree with that myself because I don't believe that theft can be justified by anybody.
You've got taxes, but you've got taxes.
No, listen. Theft, even if the entire world was to stand up, including the Muslim world, and if they justified theft of Jewish land, I would stand up against them. Why? Because my law doesn't come from what people say.
Right.
My law comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And an injustice to a Jew or a Christian or an atheist is an injustice. I will stand with the Jew, I will stand with the Christian, I will stand with the atheist. Even if my own father is stealing your land, I won't justify it. Okay? Now, so if the United Nations say that this land is going to be given and the Palestinians have to be taken out of this land, for me that's theft. So I don't, however, my Jewish friends say to me that United Nations have given us this. What about the 70, 80 resolutions that the United Nations have passed against Israel? You don't abide by any of those. You want your cake and you want to eat it. On the one hand, you say that you justify it because they gave it to you, but the 70, 80 United Nations sanctions against you to remove the wall, to remove the blockade, to remove the cattle grids that you have these people walking through like animals. If you look at the Holocaust, the pictures of the Holocaust.
No, we're not going.
No. I'm not equating the two. I believe 6 million Jews being gassed is very difficult to equate to even what's happening to the Palestinian people. But nevertheless, there are some similarities. So for example, where you have those cattle fenced corridors where that Palestinians are shoved into the checkpoints, where they stand in the sun for hours on end, only to be humiliated, when they get to the other end, yes? Many of them turn back. When we look at the pictures of the Nazis when they were cattling like animals, the Jews, how deplorable, how disgusting that was. My question to you, Josh, is this. As a Jew, any similarity to what was done to your people, you should not tolerate when it's done to the Palestinian people. Because as it would hurt you to see those images and be reminded of what happened to you, you should not ever justify that happening to another people.
Right.
And yet that's exactly what they're doing. The utter subjugation and humiliation of a people, the deprivation, the hit squads that go out every night. Now, this is not me saying it. If you go to ex-Jewish soldiers, the whistleblowers, what are they saying? They say that we will routinely go into 6 or 8 houses every night just to let them know that we are here and we occupy you. We wake up the children, 5-year-olds, 7-year-olds, 8-year-olds, standing them up. This is utter humiliation of a people. And don't believe me, go onto YouTube, do your own research. Were these really soldiers in the Israeli army? And that they're giving witness statements of how they harass these people on a daily basis. As a Jew, I think you should stand up against that as well. As a Jew, more so. You know why? Because it was done to your people. Humiliation and subjugation and oppression was done to your people. So you should be the loudest voices against this. Really. It's an injustice. It's unfair. Now, I'm not saying, people say, Muslims, they want the annihilation of Israel. They want the annihilation of Jews. I believe that the land was being shared for thousands of years. And the land should be shared today. There should be equal rights for people to work, to travel, to do what they want. If there are criminals that want to cause you harm, arrest them. jail them, just as if there are criminals within your, your people. If they're criminals and they want to go out and do violence, arrest them, jail them. But don't humiliate and subjugate and oppress an entire people.
So what do you think the solution should be? Because
Well,
people often talk about the injustices.
There are 2 or 3 solutions.
Right.
Okay? Number one,
Let's say you're the Israeli Prime Minister.
Professor
today.
Norman Finkelstein. Professor Norman Finkelstein said something very interesting. He said, just as Gandhi said about India when it split, that I don't accept the legitimacy of Pakistan because they partitioned, right? In I think 1948, Pakistan and India. 47, 48, right? They partitioned, right? Gandhi, as a proud Indian, said, I don't accept the legitimacy of Pakistan, but I accept the reality of Pakistan. Similarly, I don't accept the legitimacy of Israel. And I can't, as a Muslim. As a Muslim, I cannot justify the theft of a land from a people, even if my own father did it, let alone somebody else doing it to the Muslims. So I can't legitimize what they did. But there is a reality now. The land was taken. There are people there. Now, second generation, third generation, what are you going to do with that? So what are you going to do? Well, what you would do if you were fair is you would let people have equal rights to land, to homes, to work, to the politics of the land, to running their affairs. And if you allow that, now,
So in that vein, do you think therefore they should scrap the Oslo Accords and simply go with, we're opening up equal rights to every resident in Gaza and every resident in areas A and B?
Well, let's look at the Oslo Accords.
Yes.
Right? Madeleine Albright, I think, was one of the major, constructors of that accord, if I'm not mistaken. Are you aware of that? I don't know.
I don't know the names of this.
All
I know is
Madeleine
Arafat.
You know what Madeleine Albright said after it was constructed?
Yeah.
It's a sort of autonomy for the Palestinian people. Apparently, if I remember rightly, the Oslo Accord meant the Golan Heights was still going to remain within Israel.
Yes.
Israel would still have this, I think, the Settlers Road that would dissect Palestinian territory, so you could have military vehicles running right the way through Palestinian land.
Right.
And all of the mountains and hills surrounding the Palestinian areas would still be occupied by Israel.
Right.
So you'd basically have your guns pointing at the Palestinian people. This is not freedom.
But that's not my question, though. My question is...
My point to you is this. It was a mass prison that they were asking them to take, right?
I understand your position.
Now, the point here is this. You would agree, I would hope, that fairness means that there has to be equality between the people,
yes,
right?
I agree with you.
So fundamentally, that's not the case in Israel.
So what I'm saying is, if you want there to be the equality that you're advocating, which, okay, so in that case, should we then get rid of the Oslo Accords entirely? Should we then take down the wall from Gaza, make everyone in Gaza an Israeli resident, get rid of the distinctions between areas A, B, and C, right? Get rid of right, and give everyone their citizenship of Israel.
Well, yeah, I think that would be a start. But I think what should also happen is
because you're not going to get a
the hundreds of thousands of Palestinian people that were forcibly removed from their towns, and they lost their lands and they lost their houses. There has to be some compensation, just as the Holocaust compensates the Jews against the governments that were seen as complicit with the Germans, okay, who lost wealth, they lost property, they lost land. There is a compensation for those Jews, right? The Palestinians need to be compensated for their losses. You know? And there has to be equality.
Right. So after those two things have happened, right? So this is all way theoretical, and I don't think it's going to happen.
It's never going to happen.
It's never going to happen. right? But theoretically, they get rid of the wall, they give everyone in Gaza citizenship of Israel. They get rid of the distinctions between the areas A, B, and C, and give all of the residents citizenship of Israel.
They're all equal.
Right? Everyone is equal.
And treated equally.
Right? Equal under the law. And they give compensation to those who had their land taken away from them.
Yes.
Right? What then?
Well, hopefully you live in peace.
Good. Do we then, right? Is there then a need for a two states, or is it then simply a binational state?
The thing is this, right?
Because I think a binational state is the best solution.
Right. Look, it's not for me to decide for the Palestinian people what they want.
Right.
You know, I'm not Palestinian. If what they want is a two-state solution, then that's their right to ask for, because within the framework of what they feel is fair, according to what's happened to them, it's their right to ask for what they want, right? But my personal inclination is that it would be better if there was equality. Now, the reason why I believe that the two-state solution is sought after by many Palestinian people is they don't believe that there will be equality. They believe that what will actually happen is it will just be a one state by words, but in action, actually, it will be something completely different.
Like a two-tier system.
A two-tier system, right? And many people, including Mandela, have referred to what Israel is doing to the Palestinians as apartheid. It's a two-state solution. There's two laws, two different roads for people to travel down. You can't travel down this road. You can only use this road. Now, this is apartheid.
Right.
And this has to be wrong.
It's interesting actually, because it seems to me, and I might be wrong about this, it seems to me that whole system of the different mini-states, the different autonomy things, has only come about because of the Oslo Accords. So would you then say, if that is, or was it already this type of two-tier system before that?
Well, look, Josh, if we look at what's been happening since the formation of Israel, there is a relentless agenda to exterminate, to get rid of the Palestinian people. And since the formation of Israel, 1947, right? 48, sorry. That's why I get mixed up with the Pakistani and independence. 48, you have a systematic approach by the Israelis to take all of the land. Now, how can I justify that? How can I evidentially show you that is exactly what's happening?
Settlements.
Huh?
The settlements.
You go and look at the map of Israel, 1948, prior to 1948, 67, and modern time today. And you look at the stages, Josh, and what you see is the Palestinian territories, year by year, shrinking. Now, hold on. The thing is this, right? That does not happen accidentally or somehow organically. This is a well-planned, very well-oiled machinery that is systematically taking out these people and stealing their land. Now, what Israel is very clever at is Israel does not want to go in and just bulldoze everything and just take it all in one go. It does it slowly but slowly. It has a long plan. What do we want to achieve in 50 years' time and create the least amount of ripples, right, through the world? We keep our propaganda, we keep all that going really strong, while we keep slowly chopping off a little bit here, chopping a lot of it there. Eventually we get all the land with the minimal amount of disruption and ripples, as it were, around the world, and we accomplish our goal. Very clever. Very, very clever. But that is what's happening, and that's the proof of it is that when you look at those maps, you see that they've stolen they're stealing all the land, all the resources. 98% of the water in Palestine is not drinkable. It's not fit for human consumption. It doesn't happen by accident. The way the water is directed for Israelis and for Palestinians, it doesn't happen by accident. The way that you destroy an economy by when you have a farmer and he has his goods and you let them rot on the checkpoint to destroy the economic stability of that person and those people doesn't happen by accident. This is systematic, and it's wrong. It's really wrong. And I don't say...
I didn't really answer the question though.
Which is what?
You forgot the question.
No, you said
why.
after you scrap it and there's equality, then what happens?
That wasn't the question you were supposed to...
What was the question? Sorry, what
the
was
question was, the two-tier system you're referring to that has been compared to apartheid seems to me to have actually started with the Oslo Accords.
No, it's from the beginning.
I
said
that. But was there a two-tier system before that?
But I've answered that to you. I said from day one...
There was already a two-tier system.
There's a two-tier system. I'll tell you why there's a two-tier system. If you look at some of the articles which are well referenced, if only Americans knew, I think that's the website, I'd advise you to have a look at the web, and I would say challenge the quotes that they have in there. What you find is that from the very formation of Israel, you have truckloads and truckloads of people on gunpoint being loaded and villages being emptied out to make room.
Right,
That's a two-tier system.
Right.
How can there be equality if that's happening?
I'm talking about in places where there were both Jews and Arabs living, right, prior to the Oslo Accords. Was there a two-tier system?
Well, I don't know. You tell me.
Because I'm under the assumption that there was not, and there was no two-tier system within the citizenry of Israel during the time. Right? Are you aware of any actual laws that were in place prior to the Oslo Accords that made things different within Israeli citizenry? Because there was no such thing as a Palestinian citizenship before that, because there was no Palestinian territory. What I mean is, officially, there was no Palestinian government territory prior to the Oslo Accords.
Look,
that's what I mean.
This is one of the problems that I find with these type of discussions. To be honest about the question that you've asked, these are the very, very nitty-gritties that I don't have knowledge of, right? No, hold on a second.
That's what I'm interested in.
No, but hold on a second. No, but that's not all you should be interested in. And the reason why I say this is this. Because to some extent, it's irrelevant.
Why?
I'll tell you why it's irrelevant. Because you can get very bogged down in these details, which in reality do not affect the overall dynamics of what is happening and what has been happening. Which is that there is a concerted effort to make this a Jewish homeland for Jews and to take out everybody else there who is a non-Jew. So it doesn't change that reality. So when people, and my Jewish friends are very, very good at this, they study these little aspects of what about this, what about that, what about the 6-day war, but they miss out many other details as to what prompted those actions, right? And the fact that it still does not change the overall concept as to why Israel was created and what the foundation of what Israel was going to be. So all of the other things are often excuses but not reasons.
I'm saying, let's agree on those premises of the big macro picture.
Yes.
Right? On a micro level, right, when we talk about the specific terms that you refer to, like the apartheid comparison, what I'm suggesting is that may not have always been the case. I.e. that specific comparison can only be justified since the Oslo Accords and not prior.
But does it, even if that were true, what difference does that make to the overall situation of what Israel is doing to the Palestinian people?
Because if the problem of apartheid was started by Oslo Accords, then very possibly the logical solution to apartheid is to end the Oslo Accords.
Okay, so but again, what relevance? What relevance? See, look, the point here is this, Josh. Whether you have the Oslo Accords or you don't have the Oslo Accords, for me personally, I think it's irrelevant. I'll tell you why. Israel doesn't abide by any accord that it doesn't wish to. Israel is a law to itself. If the whole world says you've got to do this, Israel just sticks up 2 fingers and says, you know what, we're not going to listen to you. What are you going to do? And the world just sits quietly and they don't say a thing. And the reason why they don't say a thing is that Israel has incredible reach internationally, and it controls very much so, what people can say and can't say about the state of Israel. And I'll give you an example. The whole thing about if you're an anti-Zionist, you are anti-Jew. I would hope that you know that's nonsense. Now, there are some...
There is definitely a degree of truth in there. But the reason is because there's a huge overlap. The reason for that statement, I think, is not necessarily a propaganda move, and it may have been turned into a propaganda move, but as essence, there's a huge overlap between anti-Zionists and Jew haters.
Well,
a huge overlap.
First of all, that's your perception of it being huge.
It would seem to me that all Jew haters are also anti-Zionist.
Okay, but
not all anti-Zionists are Jew haters.
Yes, but
that's the big overlap I'm talking about.
Right, but Josh, you know why there's a problem there? A fundamental problem.
And I personally am not a Zionist.
Josh, you know there's a fundamental problem there, right? In part, I would agree with you that there are indeed fascist, racist ideologies that masquerade being anti-Semitic by saying that they're actually not anti-Semitic, they're actually anti-Zionist. I agree with you. There are people that are like that. I agree with you that, and you should agree with me, that there are a lot of people who say they're anti-Islam when in fact they're
Muslim,
brown face, Arabs, Asians, and what have you, right? Somebody getting arrested. Anyway, irrelevant. The circus goes on. So, what it is?
Someone should tell Abraham he loves getting
what it is, Josh. Yeah, is that I agree with you that there are people who are anti-Zionist. I agree with you that there are people who are anti-Zionist, and when in reality they're actually anti-Jew. Right. They're Jew haters. I accept that. But similarly, there are people who, who might say we don't want Romanian and Polish immigration because of these reasons. But in reality, they're just anti-foreign. They're racists. There are people that hide behind those. Right. There are loads of people who say, oh, but Islam is not a race. It's a religion, so it's okay to say derogatory things about Islam. But in reality, when you look at their Facebook posts, or when you look at who these people are, a lot of them are actually just completely anti-foreign, anti-Asian, anti-Arab, or whatever it might be. So, they're racist, right? Now, but the point here is this. Do I now say that you cannot be critical of Islam? No. I say bring it on. I say to everybody, you want to be anti-Islam? Bismillah, bring it on. We'll deal with you. I'm not going to call you an Islamophobe because you are anti-Islam. But if I'm anti-Zionist, people jump up and say, oh, that makes you an anti-Jew. That conflation, I think, is wrong. Right. There cannot be a special case for our Jewish brothers and sisters and a different case for everybody else. There has to be equality here. Right. And when we talk about, I hear some Jews say to me, oh, but it's because of our special circumstances of the sort of suffering that we had at the hands of Hitler. And I would say, as horrific and as horrible and as depraved as that was, what about the black African? Tens of millions of black Africans were loaded up like cattle on ships, just this far apart on shelves. Their excrement would fall between the planks of the wood, like animals. And half of them would die in the ship before they would get to the... Where's the voices for those black African people? Have they not suffered? What about the Indians? In the Second World War, millions of Indians... That's just one event. Millions of Indians lost their life in the Second World War. Muslims, Sikhs, Hindus, right? They lost their lives in the Second World War. Where are the voices for those people? What about their suffering? You go on Park Lane here, there's a memorial for the animals of war. Where's the memorial for the Asian and the black man and everyone else that fought in the Second World War? Where's our memorial? You have one for the donkeys and the mules and the dogs. Yes? There's statues for the dogs, statues for the horses, our lovely animals of war. What about the millions of Indians? What about the Africans? What about so many other nations that lost lives in the Second World War? Did they not suffer? So suffering has happened unanimously, universally. But we need Jewish brothers and sisters, and there are many, by the way, there are many Jews who are actively, far more active than I am, far more knowledgeable than I am, standing up against the state of Israel and the humiliation, the subjugation and the oppression that they do against the Palestinian people. There are voices, and many of them are Jews. Many of them are Jews. And the reason, I remember one of the things that Norman Finkelstein said. He said, both my father and my mother were in concentration camps. His mother, I think, was in Modonahu or Majdanek, and his father was in Auschwitz. Yes? Yes. The entire family on his father's side and his mother's side were exterminated. He had no relatives. And he said, it's precisely because of the values of what my parents taught me that I will not stand by and watch Israel do what it does to the Palestinian people. That is a man of character. That is a man of honor, of respect. He suffered greatly. He doesn't talk about it, but he suffered greatly because of the campaign against him. He couldn't get tenure in universities in America and what have you because he spoke out. And when you were smiling, when I said Israel has a very well-oiled machinery where it influences much of what happens in terms of politics, because I know that there is this trope that Jews control all the world. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying Jews control all the world. What I'm saying is that it's but common sense. If I have money and I have power and I have influence, I will use it to better me and better my people. It's logical. This is not some conspiracy where you have to sit in dark rooms smoking cigars, okay, and planning and, this is what we're going to do, right? As the trope would want you to believe. But nevertheless, this is systematic, Josh. This is systematic, Josh, sorry, right? If you look at, for example, during these conflicts, before it was commonly referred to as occupied territories. These territories were occupied. Now you find a lot of the media sources disputed.
There certainly are disputed. And all land is occupied.
Look, when you say disputed, right? There is this air of disagreement.
Yes.
Yes. But if I steal your land, if I steal your garden from the back of your house, yes, we don't call it disputed.
It certainly is disputed.
Well, we call it theft. Because if I were to call it, it's disputed, it somehow vindicates me, the oppressor, the stealer, the one who stole, from the crime of theft. I don't believe that should happen.
Right.
It's not disputed. It is occupied and it's stolen land from the Palestinian people. That is what it is. That is what it should be referred to as.
Excuse me, what's Israel?
We're having a discussion. Sorry. Okay. So Josh, I'm not trying to badger you. I think you're a nice guy. And you know what it is, Josh? I know that we have an affiliation and a love for our people and our culture and our religion. And when somebody speaks against it in some way,
yes.
though I'm not speaking against Judaism, I'm speaking about the state of Israel, a political system, because you know, in the Knesset, is it called the Knesset? Knesset, sorry, my dyslexia, right? The Knesset, yes?
Yeah.
Many of those people are not Jews, they're atheists.
Yes.
They don't even believe in Judaism.
Yeah.
They don't follow Judaism.
Yeah.
Many of them profess they don't believe in anything.
Yeah.
But Jewish
Yeah?
is a race.
So
Jewish is a race.
well, when people say Jewish is a race,
It's nonsense.
it's not really, to be honest.
Well, I know a lot of Jewish in
Well,
Manchester, they're atheists. They don't
There are a
believe.
lot of Russian Jews
But there's also a
who are
lot
not.
of Jews.
Are the Russian Jews Semitic?
Semitic.
Semites from the lineage of Abraham.
Yeah.
Ibrahim alayhi
The
salam.
Russian Jews, yes.
The Khazars. Khazarian Jews. They're not Semitic people, are they?
Khazarian Jews don't exist anymore.
But because their descendants exist, right?
No, their descendants don't exist.
But are you telling me that all of those people have been completely wiped out?
That kingdom disappears.
But-
What happened to them?
If you look at the Sephardi Jew,
Yes.
the Sephardi Jew looks more Middle Eastern.
Yes, because that's where they lived.
But that's where they live, but the history is not tens of that.
And I know plenty of Sephardim who are
My
white,
point,
by the way.
fair enough. So do I, right? But my point to you is that not all the Jews unanimously can trace their lineage from Ibrahim alayhi salam, Prophet Abraham. There are converts who came very...
Right, sure, there are
right?
converts, yeah.
Okay, that does not mean to say that I'm advocating that you can now hate Jews and claim it's a religion and it's not a race. Because I believe, to me, it's irrelevant. It's irrelevant to me whether you're a race or a religion. I don't believe that you should allow bigotry, hatred, and I don't believe you should allow speech that will potentially create ill feeling to an extent where people will attack Jews or they'll want. I don't believe in that. I don't believe that you should allow that with Muslims either,
No, of course not. Of course not.
or with Christians, or even atheists. But in this country, we have a special law for Jews, a special law for Sikhs, for example, because they're considered to be a race from Punjab. Okay? I'm not saying strip them of those protections, but I'm saying, hey, what about me? Hey, what about me? What about my children? What about the protection for us? And that protection isn't there. Legally, it's not there.
Right.
So if I say something anti-Jewish, I can be arrested. In fact, I probably will be arrested as an anti-Semite. I will be taken to court and either go through a fine, or depending on what I've said, I could be in some countries jailed, right?
Well, not so bad.
Germany. If you're a Holocaust denier,
No, England.
if you're a Holocaust denier, you go to jail.
They deny Holocaust.
Some people are stupid enough to do that,
Because that's the German.
right? Some people are stupid enough to do that, right? Now, I would never advocate that type of rhetoric, because your grandfather may have told you things that he may have seen firsthand. For me to say they were all liars and they all just made it up is absurd, right?
Yes.
And unfortunately, that's what these people believe. They believe in this sort of mass, multi-million people.
Because I'm not about Israel. Israel was Israel before.
You are not. Listen, you're not nobody.
I know.
You're the Italian stallion. You're the
No,
Italiano.
I don't believe.
You're the Italiano of the Hyde Park.
Israel before.
Was Israel before?
Yeah, of course.
Before what?
No, before was the state of Israel. Then
So
the Romans.
1948.
Yeah.
I got the date right this time, John.
Yeah.
There
Before
was
1948,
Israel.
there wasn't
No.
a country called Israel for 2,000 years. For 2,000 years.
So according to the Orthodox, you're not supposed to form the state until the Messiah comes back. Is that right?
Disputed within Orthodoxy.
Oh, is it really?
It is disputed.
When you say
see
nice
my
to meet
friend.
you,
Always nice to talk to you.
I always love your accent. It's a beautiful, beautiful, bellissimo.
There's a debate I did with a religious Zionist called Mordechai on Joseph's channel,
Right.
the Israel Advocacy Movement channel.
Yes.
About this subject of
Establishing a state.
about Judaism, whether or not Judaism forbids a state.
Yes.
And what I say, and what my teachers have taught me, is that Orthodox Judaism allows for quite a wide range of opinions on quite a wide variety of issues, and this is for sure one of them. And so I would personally see the religious Zionist viewpoint that we were allowed to establish a state during the exile as legitimate. I don't hold it myself.
Right.
I'm
So
from a
when you
different
say
school of
that
thought.
when you say there's a difference of opinion, or there are different views on this subject, in Islam, what we do is when we establish some sort of ruling, the legitimizing of a ruling often relates to consensus of scholarship.
Right.
Do you have something similar to that in Judaism?
We used to have that many, many years ago when we had the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin would issue a ruling, right, based on majority, and that ruling was binding. And so those rulings are still binding on all Jews today.
Right.
However, since the dissolution of that institution, we no longer have rule by majority. We have rule by school of thought or by tradition.
Right.
So we still have to follow the old rulings because they're binding, because they were made by the Sanhedrin.
Right.
Post-Sanhedrin rulings, however, like post-Talmudic rulings, are up for debate.
So why did they dismantle that then? Was it seen as something that was...
So it dismantled in stages. The first things that they got rid of themselves was they got rid of their powers of death penalty and stuff like that, because they said the whole point of the death penalty was that God made was supposed to be a deterrent, and now it doesn't deter, because people simply don't respect God anymore. So there's no point in having these types of punishments, and people aren't going to respect the whole idea of it. Before, it was a thing to instill fear of God amongst the people, right? So the people will realize this is the terrible thing this person has done, and therefore God has ordained this should happen. So they got rid of that, and slowly but surely got more and more things they got rid of. Now the Sanhedrin, once the Roman exile really put in, they got rid of a lot of their own powers. They got rid of lashes, they got rid of all sorts of things. Due to the fact that they didn't have a temple, they dismantled even more institutions, until eventually there was no longer people who could form a Sanhedrin. And the reason for that is because to be a member of the Sanhedrin, you needed to have what's called smicha. Now today we have something what's called smicha, but it's not the same. Smicha was started, according to us, by Moses, which entails putting your hands on the student's head and bestowing upon him this role that he's able to make certain rulings, and he'll be able to be part of the Sanhedrin. It's preceded by years and years of training and of teaching, by intense teaching by the teacher to the student. And so Moses gives that to Joshua in the book of Deuteronomy. And we believe that was an institution that continued all the way till almost the 10th century. The last people who had, but without a smicha, you can't have a Sanhedrin. So once they decided, there was no one who nobody wanted to get smicha anymore, because they thought they themselves weren't worthy of getting it, and people who had smicha didn't want to give it to anyone because they were afraid that people weren't worthy to receive it either. So that. And in fact, you had the bizarre notion of so the last people who held smicha at all were known as the Gaonim, and it was a whole series of heads of schools in Babylon, and for a time in Israel as well, that continued till the 10th century. And you had the last, and there's a dispute about who the last Gaon was. They continued passing down this smicha institution throughout, and so they were issuing rulings for everyone. Why is there a dispute about who the last one was? Because the second last one, of High Gaon, decided to give smicha and to appoint to his student Rav Chizkiah Gaon. Rav Chizkiah Gaon said, I know he's given it to me, but I don't accept, because I don't think I'm worthy enough. So there's a dispute between the teacher and the student about, but practically speaking, from then on, there's no.
So that was around the 10th century?
Yes, that was already in the 10th century,
right?
Or early 10th century.
So sort of thereafter, there is not this.
We no longer have a centralised power.
Consensus.
We no longer have that ruling by consensus.
But isn't there a danger with that, Josh? Because then what happens is you can have individual rabbis making quite, let's say, opposite rulings almost, and people saying, well, we don't have consensus, but I'd follow this guy here. So, is there not a problem with that?
So the general rule is what was codified in the Mishnah in Tractate Abbas, where it says the words "Asay lecho rav," which means make for yourself a teacher. You should find a teacher, a rabbi, and stick with him, right? And follow his rulings. You shouldn't chop and change between different opinions.
Yes.
Right? So you shouldn't say, I'm going to be lenient by this guy and lenient by that guy and lenient by that guy as well. You shouldn't do that.
Yes.
Equally speaking, there are many people who say you shouldn't go stringent by this one and stringent by that and stringent by that.
Because I see a problem there, and the problem that I see is that with religion and with non-religion, you'll always have a certain number of people who will often have quite extreme views, and they'll almost justify anything.
Right.
Now, where I believe we have protection in Islam is that even if a scholar who is recognized to be a scholar says something like, it's okay to go and bomb these people or whatever, the consensus of scholarship will say it's haram, it's forbidden.
Right.
And therefore, you can't have a justification of following that particular scholar. So ijma, jama, the Prophet ﷺ said to us at times, especially when there's confusion, go with the ijma, go with the jama, go with the consensus, because logically it is less likely that the consensus would all get it wrong and a very small minority would get it right. So this is, I think, a very sensible approach that you had. Unfortunately, I think that you gave up in the 10th century, which I think opens up to this point what you made about, Joseph having somebody on his channel, because from my understanding, and again, this is very superficial and completely, I would say, subjective in the sense that, anecdotal, right? That there seems to be a much greater consensus amongst the practicing Orthodox Jewish community that the state cannot be formed until the second coming of, or the coming rather, not the second coming because you don't believe in the second coming, but the coming of the Messiah.
Yeah.
Right? Am I wrong in that, or?
Not quite. So I'll tell you something. That in the late 19th, in the 19th and 20th centuries, there were various arguments between rabbis, mainly in Europe, because this is where these ideas were kind of floating around, as to what exactly should we do to alleviate our own persecution. And there was, so you had rabbis like Abbas, for example, who founded what is the Chorvei Tzion movement, which was kind of like a settling movement, which predated the Zionist movement. It was an entirely religious movement, at least to begin with, when he was head. And he held it's completely permitted, because he said that this passage in the Talmud is not actually a legal ruling, because Maimonides doesn't quote it as such.
Sorry, Josh, I'm interrupting, but my point.
Yeah, I'm coming into it.
No, I understand that there were. I understand that there are some rabbis who.
At the time, so there were three opinions, but the middle one was the main opinion. I'm going to get to that. So that's one side. The other side was spearheaded by rabbis, mainly like the Munkat Shurov, who was. Have you ever heard of Satmar? Have you ever heard of Satmar?
No, I haven't.
Satmar.
No.
So Satmar are a big group. They're in America, they're in Israel, they're also in Stamford Hill.
Okay.
Yoel, who comes here, he's a Satmar.
Okay.
So the Satmarov, his teacher was the Munkat Shurov, Rav Shapiro, Lozer Shapiro, and he held it's completely forbidden, because he said this ruling is actually a legal ruling. Both of these were accepted by very few people. The main ruling was the ruling by Rav Meir Simcha of Dvinsk, and he held that although it is permitted, it's not something that we have to do, and certain care should be taken around how exactly it's done, right? And he ends up being the ruling that is held by most. So he doesn't hold it was a sin to make the state. He would hold that there's certain things wrong with how it was done, and if you're going to make it, it's going to be religious, but you can't be provoking the Gentiles and this and that, and right. So he's got various things, and that is really the general consensus amongst Orthodox Jews. I happen to be from a minority point of view that actually holds it's forbidden to start with. the rabbi I hold of, Rabbi Shimshon Hirsch, he actually argued with the Kalisha and said what you're promoting is actually what you think is a very good deed, is a mitzvah we call it. I consider no small sin. So there's that. The general consensus, which became known as the Aguda, which at one point was having allowed talks with the Zionist movement, and at one point then pulled out when they said you've gone too far. So they are really the general consensus, and a lot of people, a lot of Orthodox Jews even, don't realise that that's actually the middle ground. So really, the general consensus is that it is permitted, but in certain ways.
What do they say about the rights of the Palestinian people? Should they be given equal rights?
So I have to say, there's been very little talk about that issue, because they were talking about, because most of these debates happened before a state of Israel was even a possibility, right? The Aguda, basically, which was the movement that comes out of this consensus, basically was a movement that basically said, we don't intend on running the country, we don't intend on making any policies, we basically just have one thing in mind, is just to make sure that religion is respected in the country.
Yeah.
And that's basically their entire position. And that's
so from your Orthodox position,
they haven't really discussed. But you'll find that within the Knesset, you'll find that the members of the Aguda party, the United Torah Judaism party, are much more likely to open up cross-party things with the Arab parties, and that's been something that's been going on.
I'm just asking you, in terms of like at synagogue and when things are being spoken about, or even in daily conversation with rabbis, with relatives, does the topic of the Palestinian people come up, and how we can perhaps better live with the Palestinian people? Because from what I've seen, and again, it's anecdotal, and I'm not going to make accusations that this is how Jews think. That I don't like doing that. It's not fair. But anecdotal, they just seem like as a vermin. They're seen like as that we were there before them. They don't deserve the land, and that, to be really honest, if they get bulldoze them right out of the country, it doesn't matter. Basically, this land belongs to us. Is that the? I mean, am I wrong? Am I wrong in that? Or?
I think so.
Okay.
I can't speak for all Orthodox Jews, but just in the conversations I have with people on a daily basis, I haven't heard that type of rhetoric. I have heard the rhetoric of we need to do certain things to protect against terrorists and this kind of stuff, right? I'm sure you're familiar with that kind of rhetoric. So you surely hear that. And there are some racists in the community, and we all have them.
Of course.
Right? I have, yeah. There are a few.
The astonishing thing, Josh, is this, what to me, the definition of terrorism, even though people say, well, it's specific, it only means that violence that tries to change or alter political direction is terrorism, okay? I would say, really, the terrorizing of any people is wrong.
Right.
And political or non-political, apolitical, doesn't matter, right? And isn't it interesting that the Palestinians are viewed as terrorists when they're not the ones with the guns, the bullets, the Air Force, the Navy, and the nuclear weapons. And the one that has all of that and utilizes much of that, military strength, military power, against a predominantly unarmed civilian population, are the good guys, and they're not the terrorists. I find that really odd. I find that really odd.
The general thing that people, at least in my community, when they talk about this subject, would usually be something along the lines of, I feel sorry for them, they're being kept down by Hamas, and Hamas are really to blame.
Blame Hamas.
Right? That's the usual thing. And to be honest, it is understandable, because from our perspective, when Gaza had been given to them, and rightly or wrongly, whether or not maybe they should have the whole land or this or that, right, or it should be given to them, it's theirs to start with, rightly or wrongly, the perception is that when they gave up Gaza and gave it to them, that they should have, right, if life gives you lemons, make lemonade, but here life was giving you much more than lemons, right? Who thought that a country which had all the power was going to give up a huge amount of land and take its own civilians out. Who thought that was going to happen, right? And a lot of people criticised the Israeli government for doing so, right? The much more extreme Zionists were very critical of this idea of land for peace that they talked about. So from our perspective, we say that, look, if you want to start firing rockets from there, then we're gonna do something to protect. If you're going to start being violent, then we're going to do something. If you're going to vote in Hamas, then what do you expect is going to happen?
Let me answer that.
So,
right?
well, they could have voted in a more moderate people, and they could have actually done something good for the people, and then Israel wouldn't have anything to say.
You know what? I've heard this mentioned many times before. So
that is
the two main perspectives you've raised is Hamas and rockets. Yes. Okay. There was no Hamas and there was no PLO for the first few decades of the State of Israel. The persecution, the humiliation was there for decades before Hamas even was thought up and came into existence. That's the first thing.
Yeah, that's true.
Secondly, under the United Nations, an occupied people have the right to defend themselves and their land militarily, using whatever means they have to evict the occupier. This is under international law, and this is not unusual. This is not unusual for as a global consensus of what is justifiable. Okay, so even under the United Nations, it's justifiable for the Palestinian people to have an armed struggle against the Israelis. That's the first thing. Now, I'm not justifying the targeting of civilians, because under Islam, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, even on the battlefield, when the two armies have met, you cannot kill women, and you cannot kill children, and you cannot cut down trees, and you cannot kill the animals, and you cannot poison the water. In other words,
who told you this?
In other words, you have to. You know what, bro? You know what? You just have hate. You just have hate in your heart, and you can't get over this cancer. It's eating you up, right? These are the actual words of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that you cannot do this. So even if a Muslim goes and targets a Jewish child, a Jewish woman, even a Jewish man who has nothing to do with the conflict, I would say that Islamically, from my understanding as a layperson, that the Prophet's words are very explicit, that you cannot target civilians, right? But armed struggle is even recognized by the United Nations. When an occupier occupies your land, you have the right to fight back. Now let's look at the rockets that you mentioned. This is I feel, a real either misunderstanding of what's happening or a deliberate way of orchestrating or constructing an argument to make one side feel that they are the victims, i.e. the Jews, the Israelis, and the other one is the perpetrator of violence. There were no rockets for the first so many decades of the eviction of the Palestinian people. That's the first thing. The clock of this conflict did not start with the rockets being fired.
That wasn't it.
My point to you is this. You see, look, Josh, if I slap you, and I keep slapping you, and I keep slapping you, and after 6 months of slapping you, you punch me, and then I come and I kill you, and then I say, if you didn't punch me, I wouldn't have killed you. Is that fair? This is not fair. Because let's have a nice conversation, right? So when now Jewish brothers and sisters say to me that if they never fired the rockets, we wouldn't have to basically squash them. There's a lot happening before the rockets. Now let's even look at the rockets. In the last conflict, I think it was either cast-lead or protective edge. I can't remember the name of the conflict. I think maybe cast-lead or anyway. The Israelis claimed